Hey, what's up? My name is JM Chaley and welcome to my channel. This week I want to try something new. I want to do a spotlight. Not a creature spotlight this time, but a weapon spotlight. I am a writer of the fantasy fiction genre. I do medieval fantasy, so a lot of what I have in my stories are weapons, medieval weapons, ancient weapons, you name it. And I want to showcase these weapons as accurately as I possibly can. So this week I want to talk about the sword, but not really. Swords are everywhere in fantasy fiction. They dominate the genre in medieval fantasy. You see them with every hero. Even in role-playing games, all the magic weapons are swords. Like everything is sword, sword, sword. They are wielded by everyone and anyone, and they dominate even the historical dramas that we see. But were swords really all that prevalent? Yes. Well, no. Well, yes, but no. Let me explain. Swords were mostly your backup weapon. From ancient times all the way through medieval times, or the Middle Ages, or whatever you feel like calling them, the sword was kind of your sidearm. You had it with you in case you needed it, but it wasn't your primary weapon. In ancient times, the Romans had a gladius, which is a pretty short sword. You don't really want to get into a melee combat with someone with a short sword like that. You don't have a lot of reach, and you're going to have to get up close. And guess what? They've got a weapon too. So the primary weapon of the centurion was a spear. And if someone got close enough where a spear wasn't that effective, out came the gladius, right? Archers also would carry short swords with them. If anyone broke the line and got to the archers who were way in the back, you're probably pretty fucked if that happened anyway. But hey, out came the swords. Even in medieval times, knights and other warriors would prefer much longer weapons, like pole weapons, like halberds or billhooks. They'd use spears when mounted on horseback, and they still had swords with them in case they needed them, in case they were dismounted or had to get off or fight if someone got too close. So swords were around, but they weren't the first choice of people. The only exception was maybe gladiators. And when plate armor came on the scene, swords were rendered all but ineffective. But I want to focus on two weapons, or two families of weapons, the axe and the hammer. These weapons existed about as long as swords had, but their effectiveness maintained and persevered through the evolution of armor, even when plate came on the scene, when the effectiveness of the sword fell short. But don't just take my word for it. Let's see for yourself. I've got weapons. I've got pumpkins. And I'm not afraid to destroy things in the name of science, or fiction, or history. Let's go. Alright, so we have three different weapons here. One is the sword, the other is a warhammer, the other is a battle axe. This axe is kind of like a Danish axe, single bit. The shaft is metal, so it's probably a little heavier than what they actually would have used, but it's not that bad. The heft is pretty good. The sword is Celtic. This is based off of an Irish sword. This is probably what, some of the legendary swords of Celtic myths would have depicted. Fragora, Morita, and even Excalibur probably would have looked like this, according to the ancient Celts. So we get that guy. And the last is my warhammer, which is actually a lucerne. And the difference is the tip is pronged like that. So, and then the spike on the end. So that's got a nice swing. And we are testing them out on pumpkins. So I've rigged up this stepladder with a counterweight on the the back. But this guy's still going to go flying when we hit it with any force. So I'm going to try something that might anchor it down a little bit. Alright, so I've used a C-clamp that might hold it in place a little bit. I mean, if this thing goes bouncing off, I guess I don't really care. But I want it to stay put long enough to absorb the shock of the weapon and take the damage. If it rolls off afterwards, I don't really care. But I don't want to have the weapon hit it, and then it goes flying, and the weapon really doesn't do damage because it's knocked it away instead of going through it. So that's kind of my goal here. So X marks the spot. I've instructed my son to hit right here, and we're gonna do the sword first. All right.
There we go.
So yeah, that went right through. Nice gouge into it. I don't know if we can see how deep that is, but that's definitely not something you're going to want to get hit with.
Yeah.
Next, we're going to do the axe. Thank you. Yes. I said to the hell with the C-clamp. It wasn't really adding anything, I don't think. So we're going to try the axe next and see how that goes. Now that's something you actually got, you know, a weak swing because you whacked something, right?
Yeah.
But this thing still took its damn head off. It did more damage than the sword even after you hit this thing.
Yeah.
Oh boy. We're going to try another swing and see if we can get a pure, unobstructed swing and see what happens.
I hit the X.
Yeah, you did. Maybe come down on it, I don't know. Jesus Christ. So you still hit something before, and it's still, I mean, this thing is...
I hit the wood.
You still hit the wood, and it's still... Did you hit something before it went into it?
No. I hit the wood after.
You hit the wood after, so that was like clean through. I mean, that is... Oof. So here's the sword, right? A nice clean sword hit. And here's the axe. Two different axe swings. The first and then the second. Big difference. Oh my God. Is it any wonder why the axe was favored by the Danes over the sword? Or by the Norsemen? Is it any wonder? All right, next up we're going to do the hammer. The war hammer, the lucerne. We're going to see what happens here. Did you hit something first?
No. I hit it.
Okay. So it happened just the way you thought it would.
Yeah.
It sunk right in there, all the way in. I mean, that's... Now, you know, of course a pumpkin is basically hollow inside. Not completely, but, I mean...
Still went right through.
And the indentation here, along here.
Yeah. I think if I gave more force, it would have done what you said.
Where it collapsed. And then... Yeah, so even if you had a helmet on, you're not wanting to get hit with a hammer. So let's try the spike. The other end of that thing is a spike.
That one had a lot more force, it looks like.
Yeah.
Than the hammer.
Yep. But look at this. Oh my God. You cracked it.
Yeah.
All the way through. I mean, that's just the pumpkin.
Yeah.
You know, flesh isn't going to react that way, right? Necessarily. But you can see that the impact shocked all the way through this way, which would mean you know, if this was someone's body, it would probably tear into the skin a little bit. Whereas in a pumpkin, it cracked. So just to recap, the sword, you know, a nice clean slice, very clean. Not as deep as the axe, which was a more vicious slash and deeper. Both slashes for sure. And the lucerne, the war hammer. Hammer here. Hammer here. You know, this is a bludgeoning attack, so it's not a slashing attack, right? Different type of damage. And then a piercing attack here, which accompanied a crack through the pumpkin. Damn. So there you have it. A pumpkin is probably not too much more durable than human flesh, although human flesh isn't going to cave in like the shell of a pumpkin will. But you're still gonna get some concussive force, bones would break, and you're probably going to need a healthy amount of stitches against stuff like that. A word of note, the sword wasn't particularly sharp. I know there's instances where you can see swords cutting clean through watermelon and pumpkins and things like that. There's plenty of videos out there. We didn't have that skill, and you know what? The average soldier may not have had that skill either. So what we tried to do was a consistent swing on all three weapons, just to give an idea of the general impact, no pun intended, of each of the three weapons and their effectiveness. The axe was not also particularly sharp, although it wasn't completely dull either. But the thing about the battle axe, or the war axe, or the Danish axe, or all the different varieties of axes that we've seen, it was a little bit more like a concussive weapon. Sure, it would cut, but all of that kinetic energy concentrated on that small space, just like a warhammer would be, hitting devastating concussive attack. I do also want to make a note about the battle axe and the warhammer, whatever varieties you've seen them in, and the difference between the real weapon and the fantasy weapon. I feel like we always see either a double-bitted axe, which is a double-bladed axe, war axe, battle axe, whatever, or we see sort of a double hammer on both sides. Even Thor's Mjolnir was drawn and shown, depicted, and not just in Marvel Comics, by the way, but in classic drawings and art of Mjolnir. It was shown as a twin hammer. And I hate to tell you, but that's not technically a warhammer. It's a mallet. And if it was any bigger, it would be considered a maul. If you've ever seen the giant hammer that Harley Quinn wields, that's a maul. Sorry. But, you know, we make exceptions. The thing about why it wasn't practical to double up on a weapon like that, two hammer heads or two axe heads, is because you've already got one. And it didn't matter if the blade on the axe, for example, went dull, because you can still use it quite effectively as a concussive weapon. Now, if you were a woodsman or a lumberjack and you're out cutting down trees all day, yeah, you want a double-bladed axe, because if one got dull, you're not cutting down any trees that day. So you'd flip it and then cut with the other side, and then later at the end of the day, maybe you go and sharpen both sides. That's a tool, not a weapon. So what people did was take the axe, put the axe on one end, and on the other end of the weapon had maybe a hammer or a spike. So these were very effective weapons, and when you introduce plate into the mix, they're still very effective because of that concussive force. Whereas a sword, bounce right off plate, really isn't going to do much unless you got a really good thrust in. But guess what? As plate came along and the axe family evolved and the hammer family evolved, you'd get spikes added to the heads of these weapons, or the backs of these weapons, so you could hook and spear and pierce, or thrust, jab, and pierce. So what about you? Do you have a medieval fantasy book? What does your character wield? What kind of weapons do they use? Would you consider a weapon that isn't a sword? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So that about wraps it up. A couple of different weapons that were a lot more effective and a lot more prevalent than the sword. And please, no disrespect for the sword. The sword was a very effective weapon. We see it in multiple cultures. We see it all over the place, multiple varieties. There were lots of ways that swords evolved to become longer and greater. Great sword, right? And survive through the ages. We see swords in the hands of cavalrymen in the 1800s. Swords were still very effective, but they just weren't the weapon of choice over certain battles, like infantry battles during certain ages through the medieval period. If you like this video, please give it a like, and as always, please subscribe. I post every Thursday, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.